So when we talk about mountains, there's something very, very interesting about climbing mountains. There's two unavoidable realities when you spend time in the mountains. One is false summits, where you think that you're to the top of the mountain, but what you realize is when you get to what you thought was there, it's not there. There's still more yet to come, more climbing yet to come. And two, difficult parts of the journey, right? They're unavoidable in the mountains, but not unique to the mountains. You can have never climbed a mountain in your life, but still experience what it feels like to think you've made it, or think you've climbed to the top and you get to where you think is there, and there's still more to go. There's still higher territory to be taken, or to experience difficult sets of circumstances along the way, difficult parts of the journey. So the question really isn't how do we avoid those kinds of things. The question really is how do we handle false summits? How do we handle the difficult parts of the journey? And perhaps the best way to handle all of this is with clarity, right? To understand where the summit actually is, to understand what might be expected along the way. So one of the things I love to do before I climb a mountain or before I go out on any kind of adventure, I'll talk to other people who have done that same adventure, and I'll just say, okay, talk me through it. What should I expect? Is there anything I need to be aware of on the trail? Is there anything you would do differently if you were doing this hike again, or if you're doing this climb again? Doing everything I can to get clarity on what to expect along the way. It helps you be ready for those moments. There might be trails where someone says, look, you're gonna see false summits along the way. You're gonna think you're there, but you're not there. Or there's this tricky part of the stretch where you need to be aware that this is how you need to navigate that particular part of the trail. The mountaintop is a really, really good place for getting clarity, to get your bearings, to see where you're heading, to see what the journey looks like from where you are to where you're heading, and to understand maybe some pieces of what you're going to experience along the way. This morning, though, it is not lost on me as I'm preparing and praying over this passage, praying over this conversation this morning, just recognizing that many of us are traveling this trail of life with something less than clarity. Or we don't have the kind of clarity that makes the journey easy or that makes things expected. So let's talk about what that looks like before we get into the kind of clarity that moves us forward. To travel without clarity, maybe this looks like this for you, is that you're not sure where you're heading. Or you might have a sense of where you are, right? An awareness of this is where I'm at in the whole scheme of everything that's happening. I might be able to point to where I'm at on a map. But man, I do not know exactly where it is I'm trying to get. I don't know where I'm heading. The problem is navigation is more than just knowing where you are. It's where you are and where you're trying to get to. And so if you can find those 2 points, then you can figure out how to connect those 2 points on the map. But if you only know where you are, or maybe like have a sense of where you are, that's not enough for moving forward. It's hard to make good choices about the journey when you don't know where you're heading. Or maybe the lack of clarity means we're not sure what to expect along the way. It's like we take a step and we go through different seasons of life and phases of life and moments along the way, and it's like, I had no idea what to expect. And it just feels like everything that comes at us is unexpected, and we're constantly just reacting to the things that come our way, but we don't really know what to expect, which actually amplifies what false summits feel like. It amplifies the hard stretches because we're not expecting them. We think we've got it figured out, and then we get the wind knocked out of us. We think we've made it, and we recognize that, man, we're still a long way from where it is that we're heading. Or maybe the lack of clarity is just simply wrapped up in you're not sure what you should be doing. Saying, God, what should I be accomplishing? Here, I've got these days, I've got these years on this earth, and I just don't know what it is that I should be doing with my life. What should I be doing? So like, where am I heading? What should I expect along the way? What should I be doing as I'm on this journey? This mountaintop conversation that Jesus has with his followers is all about clarity. Jesus deals with, in his own way, a particular kind of a false summit. Jesus, in his conversation with his followers, explains what it is that they should expect along the way. And then he gives simple instructions to his followers about what they should be doing as they go. But here's the thing. What makes this such a beautiful and powerful mountaintop conversation isn't just that Jesus gives clarity, right? Jesus creates clarity for his followers in this conversation. Leadership and followers. Leadership is creating clarity. And so Jesus does that. But he doesn't just create clarity, he also shows care and concern for those on the journey. He cares about the people he's talking to. And we see it because he's not just dialed in on clarity, he's concerned with the people who are listening. He's concerned with those of us now 2,000 years later who are reading this account of this moment on the mountain and trying to sort out life in response to what Jesus is teaching us. And what we see Jesus do in this conversation on this mountaintop, he's talking about some things that are very clarifying. They're hard stuff. But as he's explaining it and talking about this, it's like not said exactly like this in Scripture, but you can imagine that Jesus would maybe have taken a breath and like, I can see that this clarity is maybe a little too much to handle. Let me tell you a couple stories that might help you take hold of this. So he's giving clarity, creating clarity, and then he tells a couple of stories that help make the moment clear, help make the story and the purpose of what he's talking about clear. So this week's mountain story is found in Matthew 24 and 25. And I'll just say this as we prepare for stepping into this part of the mountain story. There have been a couple moments along the way in this journey that we're taking, these 7 mountain moments throughout the book of Matthew, that when I looked at them, it's one thing to be prayerfully planning out a sermon series. And it's another to get to a particular week, and it's like, a few weeks ago, it's the Sermon on the Mount. Like, that's a big one, right? There's a lot to cover in that. It's like, with fear and trembling, we approach the Sermon on the Mount. There's been some really fun stories along the way, but there's 2 in particular that have sort of had me sweating. It was a Sermon on the Mount and this particular conversation this morning. Because Jesus, in these 2 chapters, first of all, we're covering 2 chapters, and they're dense chapters. Jesus is talking about big stuff. He's talking about things that really matter. He's having the kind of conversation with his followers that if we could sit on a mountain with Jesus, he's answering the kind of questions that we might be asking of him. Like, Jesus, what's coming? What do I need to know about the future? How does all of this come to a close? What should I be doing in the meantime? What is it that I should be about? What should my life be marked by in this moment? This is the kind of conversation and the kind of questions that Jesus is answering that we would lean into. We would take good notes as Jesus is talking about all of this because it matters to us. It's questions that we wonder about. And so we come to this moment, Jesus having this conversation between Palm Sunday, his triumphant entry into the city, and his crucifixion. So for his followers, they've been walking with Jesus. They've seen him do miracles. They've been anticipating Jesus in some way, going very, very public with who he is. And so Palm Sunday would feel like this. In many cases, we see the conversation that Jesus has with his disciples. Palm Sunday was in many ways a false summit. It's like, okay, here we go. Now Jesus marching triumphant into the city. Here's the parade and the celebration. This is what we've been waiting for, what we've been expecting Jesus to do. We've made it. We're there. And so Jesus, in his own way, as he's having this conversation, is dealing with that false summit. But he's also preparing his followers for what to expect. He's talking about the things that he's going to experience. He's talking about what they will experience, what Christians across time will experience as human history reaches its inevitable conclusion. So he's having this conversation between this false summit of sorts, if we could call Palm Sunday that, and a hard moment, crucifixion, and then beyond, all the things that they're going to experience along the way. And Jesus speaks with clarity, and he speaks with urgency at this pivotal moment in human history, a pivotal moment in the story of the people of God, as Jesus is preparing within just a few days to literally change the course of history. But he's telling his followers what lies ahead for them. It's an important conversation. But woven into that, and the picture that he's painting as he's describing what to expect, there's intense moments in this conversation. There's imagery that as Jesus describes it, it's like, it's hard to read, it's hard to hear because that's scary. Like, there's things about that are things we worry about. He talks about judgment, he talks about persecution, he talks about famine and pestilence, all kinds of things that we would prefer not to have to think about. And then what should we do? And how should we handle the journey ahead? And it's as all of this sort of reaches its climax that Jesus says, let me tell you a couple stories that I think will help you take hold of this. And with that clarity, and with that care and concern for his followers, All of a sudden we can look from like Jesus and his followers 2,000 years ago on a mountain looking at the journey that's ahead. We can look at the journey that's ahead for us, and we can take it with a little more confidence. The things that are going to be difficult, the things that are coming our way, we can see them as a little less daunting because we know the big stuff that's expected of us. And so Matthew 24, if we're following along in this, Matthew 24, it starts with Jesus having a conversation with his disciples about the temple. And they're talking about this, they're looking at this building, and Jesus says, you could tear that down, and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And they're trying to figure out the logistics of how someone could actually do that. And Jesus is talking about his death and his resurrection. And then as he's talking, they're having this conversation. He's beginning to paint a picture of what they should be expecting along the way. He talks about what lies ahead as the age comes to a close. And he talks about persecution. He talks about hardship. He talks about the things that followers of Jesus, people who bear his name in a world that doesn't like the things that they stand for, what they're going to experience. And then he talks about what it looks like to lack the basic necessities of life and to have relationships that are broken, to experience hardship and persecution. And he's describing these moments upon moments of the difficult things that lie ahead for them on the journey, right? Still in the echoes of Palm Sunday, and now saying, but talk about the hard stuff is really just getting started. And then he closes out Matthew 24 with a conversation about when they should expect this to happen. Right? That's the inevitable question, right? Like, well, Jesus, I hear you saying that these things are going to happen, but when? Like, I'd like that kind of clarity. If you could just tell me exactly when this is going to happen, then I think we could begin to work our way back from there, be prepared for it. And Jesus says, it's not for you to know. It's not for me to tell you the day or the hour, but so I'll tell you this. Just like when you look at the changing of seasons, and you see leaves start to turn, you can discern that a season is changing. Here are some things you can be watching for. I'm not going to tell you the day or the hour. I'm going to tell you some things to be looking for. And then he talks about people who approach life with wisdom. He talks about people who approach life with a sense that God has entrusted to them, the things that they're to put to use. And as he's talking about all of this and this way of living, he turns and he says, let me tell you a couple stories. These two stories paint a clear picture of the way ahead. These two stories paint a clear picture of the bullseye for our lives. Matthew 25, starting in verse 1, Jesus says this, then the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 virgins who took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. It says 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. Now, Jesus isn't trying to make a mathematical point. He's not saying here's the ratio of wise and foolish people. He's saying there's 2 ways of operating. There's 2 ways of making decisions about what the decisions that you're facing, the way of making choices. And he explains what this looks like. He says, for when the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. And as the bridegroom was delayed, they all became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a cry, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him. And all those virgins rose and trimmed their lamps. And the foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise answered, saying, since there will not be enough for us and for you, go rather to the dealers and buy for yourselves. And while they were going to buy, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went in with him to the marriage feast. And the door was shut. In our time, we'll just pause for just a second here. Human beings like to keep our options open. We like to know that we can sort of figure out a way through whatever might be shut for us. And yet Jesus, you talk about clarity. It says at some point your options begin to narrow. At some point the door will shut. And here we are as a people saying, well, maybe we could try and negotiate this. Maybe we could try and figure out how to navigate this in a way that keeps all of our options open. We can still do the things that we want to do. And yet, like when we're ready, then the door will open for us. Jesus says, at some point, you don't know the day or the hour, the bridegroom is returning and the door will close. Afterwards, the other virgins came also saying, Lord, Lord, open to us. But he answered, truly I say to you, I do not know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Jesus is being very, very clear. He's talking very specifically about the way we live our lives, the choices that we make, the opportunities that have been given to us, the invitation that has been extended to us to life in Christ. But there's 3 lessons that actually correspond with the phases in this story. One is preparing well. The difference between the foolish and the wise young women, like the foolish women, they took a winging it approach. Like, hey, we have some oil and we'll just kind of see how it goes along the way, versus preparation for waiting well. The wise ones actually brought with them more than what they needed just to keep the lamps burning for whatever that window of time was. Wisdom led to a decision to be prepared. And so we extend this conversation and we say, so we build our reserves through spiritual disciplines, through spiritual habits, that there are unexpected times of waiting. There are unexpected things that come our way on this journey, that things might take longer to appear than what we think. We're waiting for Jesus to do, or we're longing for God to do. How do we navigate the gap between now and what could be and what will be? And we build those reserves, those things that take us through those difficult parts of the journey, those unexpected, extended times of waiting, through our spiritual disciplines, through living our lives in conversation with Jesus, through spending time in his word, through doing the kinds of things that build up a spiritual reserve for us, so that when unexpected things, or when there's a delay between what we're hoping for and what we're currently experiencing, that we navigate that gap. And we navigate that gap with the reserves that come from our spiritual disciplines and our relationship with Jesus. That's preparing well. There's waiting well. There is a difference between endurance and anticipation. There's a difference between endurance and anticipation, because we're not talking about just patience. We're not talking about saying, well, how long will this take? I will just wait. We think about this in terms maybe of the Christian life. Many of us have found ourselves, or maybe we find ourselves right now thinking, my relationship with Jesus is about getting me through all the hard stuff of life. I'm going to hold on, I'm going to suffer, and I'm going to endure, and I'm going to get through it. That Jesus will carry me through, or lead me through, or take me through all of this hard stuff. It's endurance. Anticipation says, I believe what Jesus says about the future. And so, yeah, there's stuff that I'm going to experience, and there's hard seasons and difficult things, but I navigate all of that, not just hunkering down and enduring. I navigate that with anticipation of the what will be. Right? These wise and foolish young women, they're experiencing a time of waiting, but they're not just enduring. They're anticipating a feast. Right? They're anticipating this celebration that is to come. And so they're not just saying, how do I hunker down and make it through and have enough oil to get me to the finish line. Say, I want to join the party. Endurance can be miserable. Right? It focuses actually on just navigating the misery that comes our way. Anticipation is joyful. It's focused on what will be, on what's to come, the goal that we're working our way toward. It's like, I don't want to just get to the finish line. I want to get to the finish line, and I want to be ready to party when I get to the finish line. I don't want to just endure. I want to anticipate what's next. That's waiting well. And then joining the party. The point of this story isn't Jesus saying, so this is how you wait well. This is how you endure well. The point isn't the waiting, it's the party that's to come, right? The door that opens and they're invited in. The problem with endurance is when you endure and you take on a posture of endurance, it's very, very difficult to move into party mode when you've been enduring, right? When you've been hunkered down and you're holding on and you're just trying to make it through, it's really hard to celebrate. It's really hard to move into party mode and feast mode when you've just been working through and enduring hard things that come your way. We're so focused on getting there, right? Getting there, that we can forget what there actually is. Maybe it helps if we say it this way, that if we endure long enough, that we start to think that enduring long enough is the point. If we endure long enough, then we start to think that enduring long enough is the point. And so we hunker down and we deal with the hard stuff that comes our way, but we lose sight of the celebration that's to come. Which leads as Jesus so wisely and so beautifully did, leads to his second story in this conversation. It's a conversation about how to approach life in Christ. How do we handle what's been placed in our hands? How do we handle what has been entrusted to us in Christ? So Jesus gives another picture of how things will play out. He says, let me tell you this story, starting at verse 14. For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another 1, to each according to his ability. And then he went away. And he who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had the 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug into the ground and hid his master's money. And the master returns. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, he who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more. And his master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I'll set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had received the 1 talent, came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid. I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what's yours. There's a big difference between that third conversation and the first 2, isn't there? The first 2 conversations, the servant returns and talks to the master, and it's a very simple conversation, a 1-sentence conversation. Look, you entrusted this to me, and I put it to use, and here's your return on your investment. You entrusted to me. I put it to use. Here's your return on your investment. Very short conversation. The third one, well, you gave me this 1 talent, and I went and buried it because I knew how you are. And it's this long, long response. And what's exposed in this conversation is a mentality. There's an entrusted mentality of the first 2 conversations where they say, I recognize that you have placed in my hands, you've entrusted to me, so I have put to use. But the third servant has an excuses mentality. He actually spent his energy not on getting a return for the master, but on coming up with a list of excuses for why he did not get a return for the master. And so the master's having this conversation, and this servant is saying, well, look, I knew that you're a hard man. I knew that you expect certain things, and so I just made sure I held on to what you had given me. I buried it, now you can have what's yours. There is energy and work expended in this story. And he didn't do it to get a return. He did it to justify himself to the master. And I wonder if some of us are living our lives in such a way where we're looking and we're saying, we know what we're supposed to be doing. Or we know what life is supposed to be about. We hear what Jesus is calling us to. And yet we're spending our energy making a list of excuses instead of just getting to work and doing the thing that we're being asked to do. And so we think, well, look, at some point we're going to give account for the way we've lived our lives and the way we've put to use the things that God has placed in our lives. And we're spending our time, instead of getting a return for God for what he has placed in our lives, we're coming up with a list of excuses for why we're not successfully accomplishing what God has asked us to do. It's like we think that we're going to stand before God someday and give account for our lives, and he's going to look and say, so show me what your life has looked like. And instead of just saying, look, I did what you asked me to do, we're thinking, boy, if I can make a strong enough case and enough lists of excuses of all the kinds of things that led me to be unproductive and led me to be unfaithful with God, what God has asked me to do, that somehow my list of excuses will show, will balance out the not good and not faithful parts of my life. And we're spending our energy thinking, I'm going to stand before God and give account. How will I make excuses for what I've done? Instead of just doing what God asked us to do. And the thing is, it's work either way. The question is, what kind of work is it that we want to be doing? And so the master answers. He says, you wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I haven't sown and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers. Then at my coming, I should have received what was my own with interest. Then the master turns and involves those around this conversation. He says, so take the talent from him and give it to him who has 10 talents. For everyone who has more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. This is not, just to make it very clear, this is not a conversation about poverty. Jesus is not talking about possessions. He's talking about a mentality, saying the one who has an excuses mentality will not be entrusted with more, but I can trust the one who has an entrusted mentality, who puts to use what I've asked him to put to use. And so take from the one who's making excuses and give to the one who's getting it done. He says, and cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place, there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And these are hard words. And it's even harder when we realize that it's Jesus talking, right? We kind of like know this, but when we put a really fine point on it, and we think of Jesus in terms of he expresses love and affection. We think of Jesus, and in some ways, many of us have a picture of Jesus like he's the soft version of God. Like he's like the one who expresses love, and then he says these hard words that are unsettling to us. He says, cast him out. He's talked about a door that closes. He says, so put him out into utter darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. And it's like, these are hard words to hear from Jesus. And so we do almost what the third servant did, and we end up afraid. We're afraid that we're going to end up cast out. And we're so afraid of this that we actually end up missing the actual point of the story. There's two words in this second story that unlock our understanding of the future: good and faithful. These two words give clarity about the future, give clarity about even how we're supposed to approach the journey that lies ahead. So let's talk about what good and faithful isn't. It's not comparison in any way. Right? You can't compare. It's so tempting to do this. We don't know other people's journeys. We can't compare our few things season with someone else's many things season. Right? We don't know that they've already gone through the few things. They've been faithful in the few things, and now they've been entrusted with the many things. And we're looking at their many things, and we're looking at our few things, and we're like, look, I guess God doesn't trust me as much, or whatever. And we're not comparing with each other. And we can't compare our few things season with someone else's many things season. Trust the master and trust the process. And it's not about inputs, and it's not about circumstances. Yes, there's different amounts of talents that are entrusted to the various servants, but the expectation is the same, that you put to use what's been entrusted to you. Right? So it's actually about choices and outcomes, not inputs or circumstances. Because it'd be really easy for us actually here in 2025 to say, well, God, you don't understand like the way culture is, or the way the world is, that like how could I bear fruit? How could I do what you're asking me to do with all the pressures and all the brokenness of this world? Like God, don't you understand the circumstances of the world around me? And God says, I have entrusted to you in this moment with my wisdom. I understand the circumstances. I'm asking you to put to use what I've put into your life. It's not about inputs or circumstances. It's about the choices that we make and the outcomes of the choices that we make. So that's what good and faithful isn't. Let's talk about what it is. Good and faithful is a declaration of our knowing God. Right? We declare with our good and faithful lives, we declare what we know of God. Because it starts with knowing the master. The master is good and faithful. And so what we're talking about is learning to live in the way of the master along the way. In this story, we see two different ways of knowing. There's the knowing about the master. That's the third servant. That's the one talent servant. That leads to fear. But then there's knowing the master that leads to operating like the master. They can be entrusted with much because they do with what they've been given or what they've been entrusted with, what the master would do with if the master was the one making the decisions with what's been entrusted to them. Good and faithful is an expression of our understanding of our calling as followers of Jesus. Good and faithful is our faith operationalized. It's us putting to work the things that God is doing in us. So we talk about faithful, talk about the excuses mentality versus the entrusted mentality. So I will approach my life as an expression of my understanding of my calling in Jesus. I've been entrusted. I'm not going to make excuses. I've been entrusted with whatever God has placed in my life. Therefore, I will operate as an entrusted person. Because it's work either way. We can make our list of excuses, or we can just get to work and do what God's asked us to do. With an investment from the master, making an investment for the master. And then good and faithful is the preparation for what matters in the end. Our good and faithful lives prepare us for the very, very end of our lives. The choices that we make, the way that we approach life, good and faithful is the preparation for what matters in the end. Because in the end, there's two things that matter. Whose we are. Do we belong to Jesus or not? And who we've become along the way. As we have walked with him, as he has formed us, as we have done what he's asked us to do, as we have lived our lives in the way that he's called us to live our lives, as we've lived generous lives, open-handed lives, lives that reflect the nature of Jesus. There are so many steps in the journey, so many souvenirs that we pick up along the way. But the very best one is who we become along the way. And so may it be said of us, well done, my good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your master. Right? Actually, the joy of your master is a beautiful thing, because he says, you've been faithful with a little, now I'm going to give you even more. And so the joy of the master actually is then like joy in the even more. Like there's even more that's expected of me. I'm going to find joy in that. Enter into the joy of your master. And so whatever pain we experience in the process, whatever false summits that we navigate, the difficult stretches that we experience along the way, it's worth it because we're being formed and led by a good and faithful master. So here's what Jesus had to say about the end of the journey, the end of chapter 25. He lays it out. He talks about judgment. He says there's really actually just two outcomes. When you stand and you give account to God for the way you've lived your life, there's two outcomes. One, come inherit the kingdom, right? That's enter into the feast or enter into the joy of your master. Or two, depart from me. It's like I never knew you. So our good and faithful lives prepare us for what comes at the end of the story. And so we have a picture of the destination. We have a description of the approach. We have a clear picture of what the bullseye is. So where do we go from here? Starts with 3 commitments. And I'll just say this, as we talk through this, it might be that you actually need to actually speak these in some way. We say them and then you're like, I'm going to actually make this commitment, or write them down and then like go to the mirror where you get ready in the morning and you have to look yourself in the eye and on it with a dry erase marker, write on there these 3 commitments saying, I will. And the first one is this: I will live with the finish line in mind. I will live with the finish line in mind. And I'm not talking about just like I want to make it to the end. That's endurance. I'm talking about a clear picture of what's yet to come. Jesus, tucked into all of this scary language kind of conversation, he actually paints a picture for what's to come. He says, it's like a feast with the bridegroom that you're invited into. It's a party, right? It's the joy of the master. And so we get so caught up thinking, I'm gonna think just in terms of judgment and giving an account, which is an important part of the process. But what comes through all of that is a picture of a feast, of a celebration for eternity with God. I will live with the finish line in mind. I will live with anticipation. I will live with anticipation. We're talking anticipation, not endurance, not hoping our lamps last long enough or we have enough oil to get through maybe some of what comes our way, but to say, I am looking forward to what will be. I'm looking forward to experiencing God in eternity, to enjoy him forever. That I approach life, I'm navigating all the things that I'm navigating, whatever comes my way, false summits and difficult parts of the journey. I'm doing all of that not for the sake of enduring, but anticipating what's yet to come. and I will view what I have with an entrusted mentality. I will view what I have with an entrusted mentality. Say, I will not make excuses, right? I will live with an entrusted mentality. I will put to use what God has asked me to put to use. I will live my life. Say, I want to be a good and faithful steward of what God has placed in my life. I will not spend my time making excuses. I will do the work that God has asked me to do. To do the work of the master in the way that the master would have us do the work. To live with a stewardship and investment mentality. So how do we live out those commitments? To state those commitments and to make those commitments is important, but the way we live it out is in 3 key habits. 1, live in conversation with Jesus. Spend time listening to what Jesus has to say about the way you're living your life. That's reading his word, spending time in prayer. You could take the 4 pursuits that we talk about here at Countryside, the journey together, actually being around other people who are on that journey, who are chasing after God's best for their lives. To be around people like that helps us chase after God's best for our lives. To join the cause is literally us saying we will take on as a people, part of our church culture is that we're going to operate with an entrusted mentality. To grow deeper says I want to be everything that God has created me to be. So what I'm becoming matters. That Jesus is Lord of my future, of what I'm becoming. He has authority over what I'm becoming. And then we live on mission saying, God, what is it you want to accomplish today and how can I get in on it? What is it you're wanting to make happen in this world? So we live our lives in conversation with Jesus. You pay attention to what you're becoming along the way. We are not great at paying attention to ourselves. Right? We think about ourselves a lot. We worry about the way people perceive us all the time, but we don't do a great job of spending time saying, who am I becoming? The choices that I'm making, the way that I'm operating, am I different today than I was yesterday? Am I different today than I was a year ago? And if I'm different, is it a better different? We don't do a good job. We pay attention to ourselves. We don't pay attention to what we're becoming very well. So you say, what would it look like for us to take stock of that, to spend time asking questions about who it is that we're becoming and to make a habit out of paying attention to who we're becoming? And then question 3, or habit 3, might be a habit that is a breakthrough habit for us as we live our lives. And it's simply asking this question. Ask, is this a good and faithful kind of choice? Is this a good and faithful kind of choice? I'm faced with a decision, faced with a difficult relationship. I'm faced with a situation at work. I'm faced with a situation in relationship in some sort of way. Or I've got a decision to make with something that I need to put to use in some sort of way. Is this a good and faithful kind of choice? Not, can I make excuses for what I've done? Can I justify what I'm doing right now? Is this good and is this faithful? To ask that question as we're making choices in our lives, as we're navigating all the things that come our way and the choices that we have to make along the way. Say, I don't want to just say, I hope God says I'm good and faithful at the very end, that when my life is put into balance, that more good and faithful than not good and not faithful. I want to live my life and make decisions every day and live in the beautiful reality of I'm living a good and faithful life, which means we're making good and faithful choices. And so when we're faced with a choice, or maybe we're reflecting on a choice that we just made, say, I don't know if that hit the mark. Or what would it look like if I allowed God to speak into this as a good and faithful choice? Not just at some point in the future can I justify it. Is this a good and faithful choice? We put that question into practice, we will make better choices. We put that question into practice, we don't have to worry about the future, about standing before God and giving account to him, because we have allowed him to lead us and guide us in making good and faithful choices along the way.